Brynner knelt in the Mexican dust beside Miguel Herrera's broken body and felt the old circus wound in his soul tear open again, knowing that some falls you don't get up from and some betrayals you never forgive. April 1960, Cuernavaca Desert, 106 degrees in the merciless sun, and the Magnificent Seven's leader was about to discover that the real battle wasn't with bandits on screen, but with executives in boardrooms who measured human lives in dollars and cents. If you're fascinated by untold stories of Yul Brynner's most courageous stands against Hollywood's darkest practices, subscribe to Yul Brynner Untold Legacy for more hidden moments, where moral authority challenged corporate power in the fight for basic human dignity. The 39-year-old Miguel had been working the most dangerous sequence in the film, a mounted ambush scene that required precision timing between horses, riders, and explosive charges buried in the desert floor. He was a local horseman, hired because he could do things with a horse that most professional stuntmen from Hollywood couldn't match. A father of 3 young children, a man trying to build a better life for his family through the dangerous but well-paying work that movie productions brought to their isolated community. The accident happened in seconds. Miguel's horse stumbled just as the charges detonated, throwing him directly into the path of debris that should have passed harmlessly overhead. The sound of the explosion was followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the desert itself. Yul was the first person to reach him, dropping to his knees in the dust without regard for his costume, or the cameras that continued rolling out of shock and confusion. Miguel's dark eyes found his, still conscious but fading fast, blood seeping through his lips as he tried to speak. "Mi familia," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in everyone's ears from the blast. "Por favor. Mi familia." "I hear you," Yul said quietly, taking the dying man's hand in both of his own. "I hear you, hermano. Your family will be taken care of. I promise you this." Miguel's grip tightened for just a moment, a final gesture of trust from a man who had no reason to believe promises from Hollywood people, but who somehow understood that this particular promise would be kept. When Miguel's eyes closed for the last time, Yul remained kneeling beside him for several minutes, his own eyes closed, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been a vow spoken in languages the desert wind carried away. The rest of the cast and crew stood in stunned silence, watching their leader hold vigil over a man whose name most of them had never learned, whose life had been risked and lost in service of their entertainment. When Yul finally stood, his face carried an expression that those who knew him had never seen before. Not anger, not grief, but something harder and more dangerous. The look of a man who had just made a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. "We're done for today," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent set. "Send everyone home, with pay." John Sturgis approached cautiously. "Yul, we can work around this. We can get the scene from different angles. Use the footage we have." "We're done for today," Yul repeated, his tone making it clear that discussion was not welcome. "Miguel Herrera died making our movie. The least we can do is give him 1 day of our time." The next morning, 3 studio executives arrived on set in a black Cadillac that seemed obscenely out of place among the dusty trucks and equipment that served the production. They wore expensive suits that wilted immediately in the desert heat and carried briefcases that contained what they clearly considered solutions to an unfortunate but manageable problem. The lead executive, a pale man named Harold Weinstock, who had never been closer to actual filmmaking than a studio commissary, approached Yul with the kind of nervous confidence that money usually provided in difficult situations. "Mr. Brynner," Weinstock said, consulting papers in his briefcase, "we're very sorry about the accident yesterday. These things happen in our business, unfortunately. But we've prepared a compensation package for the deceased's family that we believe is fair and reasonable." He handed Yul a check with the amount clearly visible. The figure written there was so insultingly small that several crew members who glimpsed it actually gasped audibly. Yul looked at the check for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone present had to strain to hear him. "Mr. Weinstock," he said, Would you mind joining me in my trailer? I think we need to discuss this privately." The walk to Yul's trailer was conducted in silence that felt like approaching thunder. Weinstock followed nervously, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of handling this matter personally rather than delegating it to someone more expendable. Inside the cramped trailer, Yul gestured for Weinstock to sit while he remained standing, a position that somehow made the small space feel dominated by his presence. "Tell me about your family, Mr. Weinstock," Yul said conversationally. My family?" "Yes. Children? Wife? People who depend on you for their security, their future, their ability to live with dignity." Weinstock nodded uncertainly. "2 children. My wife, of course." "And if you died tomorrow," Yul continued, his voice still conversational but carrying undertones that made the studio executive increasingly uncomfortable, "what would happen to them? How would they live? What kind of future would they have?" "Well, I have life insurance, investments, savings." "Yes," Yul agreed. "Because you're valuable to the studio. Because your work matters. Because your life has been deemed worthy of protection." He picked up the check from where Weinstock had left it on the small table. "This amount," Yul said, "represents approximately 6 months of Miguel Herrera's wages." 6 months. For a man who gave his life, making our movie profitable. Weinstock shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Brynner, you have to understand. We can't set precedents that—" "Let me tell you about precedents," Yul interrupted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more authority than any shout. "When I was young, I worked in a circus. Dangerous work, like what Miguel did yesterday. And in the circus, we had a saying, 'When one falls, we all catch.'" He moved closer to Weinstock, close enough that the executive had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "Because we understood something that you seem to have forgotten. We were a family, not because we were related by blood, but because we shared the same risks, trusted our lives to each other's skill and care." Yul sat down across from Weinstock, but somehow his seated position felt more intimidating than his standing had been. "Miguel Herrera trusted us with his life yesterday. He trusted that we would keep him safe, that we valued him as more than just an expendable piece of equipment. And we failed him." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the normal sounds of the desert seemed to have stopped in deference to the conversation taking place. "So here's what's going to happen," Yul continued, reaching into a briefcase of his own and withdrawing his personal contract for the film. "You're going to tear up that insult you call compensation. You're going to establish a fund that provides Miguel's widow with enough money to raise their 3 children with dignity." He placed his contract on the table between them. "Or I walk off this set right now, and I take every major cast member with me. And then I call every newspaper and television station in America and tell them exactly why the Magnificent Seven shut down production. I tell them about Miguel Herrera, about his family, about a studio that measured human life in pocket change." Weinstock stared at the contract with growing alarm. "You can't do that. You'd be in breach. The lawsuits alone would—" "Would what?" Yul asked. "Destroy my career? Cost me money? Mr. Weinstock, I learned to walk a tightrope 40 feet above the ground with no net. Do you really think the threat of studio litigation frightens me?" He leaned forward, his dark eyes holding Weinstock's with an intensity that made the executive understand he was dealing with something far beyond normal Hollywood negotiations. "I've seen what happens when money becomes more important than people. I've watched good men die while accountants calculated the cost of safety equipment. I've heard executives explain why someone else's family doesn't matter as much as profit margins." Yul's voice took on a quality that Weinstock would later describe as quietly terrifying. "I will not watch it happen again. Not on my set. Not in my name. Not while I have breath in my body and influence in this industry." The executive looked down at the contract, then at Yul's implacable expression, then back at the contract. Everything about his body language suggested a man realizing he had catastrophically miscalculated the balance of power in the room. What exactly are you proposing?" "A trust fund," Yul said immediately. "Enough money to support Miguel's widow and children for the rest of their lives. Education funds for all 3 children. Medical care, housing. Everything they would have had if Miguel had lived to be an old man." That could cost more than the studio spends on catering for a single week of production in Hollywood. Yul finished. Less than they pay for one magazine advertisement in Life magazine, a rounding error in the budget for executive bonuses. He reached across the table and picked up his contract. You have 1 hour to make this right, Mr. Weinstock. 1 hour to prove that this studio values human life as more than an accounting inconvenience. After that, I start making phone calls. Weinstock left the trailer looking like a man who had just survived a natural disaster. Within 30 minutes, he was on the phone with studio heads in Hollywood, explaining why the Magnificent Seven budget would need a substantial adjustment for unforeseen contingencies. The new compensation package, when it arrived later that day, reflected the true value of Miguel Herrera's life and sacrifice. More importantly, it included provisions that would transform how the studio handled stuntman safety and compensation for years to come. When Yul personally delivered the paperwork to Miguel's widow Maria, he did so quietly, without cameras or publicity. The conversation was conducted in Spanish, which most of the cast and crew didn't understand, but the tears in Maria's eyes and the way she gripped Yul's hands told the story clearly enough. "He made me promise this would remain private," Maria would say years later, when the story finally emerged through other sources. He said Miguel's dignity was more important than his own reputation, that a good man's memory should not become a publicity story for Hollywood. But she added something else, something that revealed the deeper truth about what had happened in that desert. "He told me that Miguel died as part of his family, not just our family, but the family of everyone who works in dangerous places to make dreams come true, and that families take care of each other, no matter what it costs." John Sturges would later describe the incident as a defining moment in his understanding of leadership. "I directed hundreds of films, worked with dozens of stars, but I'd never seen anyone use their power the way Yul did that day. Not for personal gain, not for career advancement, but for simple human decency." Steve McQueen, who witnessed the entire confrontation with the studio executives, was asked about it years later. "Most actors would have complained, maybe threatened, possibly walked off in anger. Yul did something different. He made it impossible for the studio to do the wrong thing. He didn't just protest injustice, he eliminated it." The studio executive Harold Weinstock was interviewed in 1978, long after his retirement from the film industry. "That day changed how I understood the business," he admitted. "I'd been thinking of production costs, liability issues, precedent concerns. Yul made me think about something I'd forgotten, that we were dealing with a human being who had died, and a family who had lost everything." He paused thoughtfully. "I went to Mexico thinking I was managing a minor crisis. I came back understanding that some things matter more than budgets or corporate policies. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only acceptable choice, regardless of cost." Yul Brynner never spoke publicly about the incident, but Maria Herrera preserved the letter he wrote to accompany the final settlement. Years after his death, she shared one passage. "Miguel died doing work that mattered, helping to tell a story about courage, sacrifice, and men who stand up for what's right. He deserves to be remembered not as an accident, but as a hero who gave everything for his craft. His children should grow up proud of their father's contribution to something beautiful." The letter concluded, "In the circus, we learned that every life has equal value when it comes to the courage required to risk everything for art. Miguel had that courage. He earned our respect, our gratitude, and our commitment to honoring his memory through action, not just words." This story reminds us that true leadership often manifests in moments when doing the right thing costs more than doing the convenient thing. Yul Brynner's response to Miguel Herrera's death demonstrated the difference between using power for personal benefit and using it for moral necessity. The studio's initial response reflected a common corporate instinct: minimize cost, limit liability, move past inconvenient tragedies as quickly as possible. But Yul's intervention forced a different calculation, one that prioritized human dignity over financial convenience. More importantly, his insistence on privacy revealed something profound about authentic moral action. He didn't publicize his stand, didn't use Miguel's tragedy to enhance his own reputation, didn't turn personal decency into professional advantage. He simply did what he believed was right, because it needed to be done. The incident also demonstrated how individual courage can create systemic change. Yul's refusal to accept inadequate compensation for Miguel's family led to improved safety protocols and compensation standards that protected other stunt performers for years to come. In a broader sense, the story illustrates the responsibility that comes with privilege and influence. Yul Brynner was in a position to demand justice not just because of his star power, but because of his willingness to sacrifice that power if necessary to achieve a moral outcome. If this story of courage, in the face of institutional indifference, moved you, Yul Brynner's Untold legacy preserves exactly these moments where Yul Brynner's deepest convictions intersected with Hollywood's darkest impulses, creating opportunities for moral leadership that transcended entertainment. His understanding that some battles must be fought regardless of personal cost, his commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and his wisdom about the difference between private virtue and public performance revealed the character that made him truly legendary. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to discover more stories where authentic moral courage challenged systemic injustice, where individual conscience confronted institutional indifference, and where the greatest stars proved their worth not through the roles they played, but through the stands they took when cameras weren't rolling. Because some lessons about responsibility, dignity, and the courage required to use power in service of justice can only be learned from those who've chosen principle over profit when it mattered most.